A couple of weeks ago, we discussed a coup that happened in Niger, a military coup. They were willing to obviously remove the leader that was there, that was put there by Western countries, a leader that would serve a country like France. I also explained to you why France is there in the first place, that France also uses or exports materials like uranium from Niger for its own country. Meanwhile, people in Niger themselves don't have electricity. So this is a big deal. And we've talked before about these Western countries coming into countries in Africa and not only stealing their resources, but also having a significant influence on the culture and the people. Colonialism is still well and alive today, ladies and gentlemen. But there was that military coup in Niger, and it appears that it has worked so far in reference to France, because now Macron has recently made a statement that they are going to withdraw ambassador and troops from Niger after the coup. Let's go ahead and get into this clip, and I have a lot more to discuss.
France is withdrawing its ambassador to Niger and ending all defense cooperation after weeks of tension with the military junta. President Emmanuel Macron says the troops will withdraw by the end of the year. Niger's military, which seized power in a coup in July, has welcomed the move, calling it a step towards sovereignty. Al Jazeera's Fadul Abdurazak has more from Niamey.
The decision by French President Emmanuel Macron to pull out his troops and ambassador from Niger was met by huge relief and celebration among the supporters of Niger's military junta. This has been quite visible in the capital, Niamey, and across the country. People here see this decision as a positive step by the French government to the demands they had, even before the coup of July 26. I spoke to many citizens who said they now believe the government is on their side, which was the #1 demand by protesters at the time President Mohamed Bazoum was ousted. Now, people believe the junta has heard the demands of not only the masses, but also organizations and agencies in the country. The military leaders have welcomed Macron's decision as the fruit of Niger's people's struggle, calling on their citizens to continue in their quest until total independence and sovereignty are restored.
That part right there where they mentioned total independence and sovereignty just goes to show you, and we'll get into this with the article as well, how much influence France has had on the people in Niger and the country as a whole. My question is, who's next? Because when they announced that France is going to withdraw because of that uprising that happened in Niger, my question was, is the United States next? Is Niger going to push the U.S. out of its country as well? And honestly, I can't be mad at them if they do. Because the reality is, how would you feel if someone came to our country and they pushed their ideals on us? They tried to influence us. And basically, like, we were living under their rule. The leader that we had, like the president of the United States, would have been installed by them, right? So these people want to be completely independent. These people want to be free from Western influence and Western imperialism. They want to have their own country back again. They want to have their own place and their own narrative in their own mind. And I think that's very important. So one of the things about this story, I think it brings the attention to the fact that, again, colonialism didn't really die. It still continues, just in a different way. So if they can push out France, it makes me wonder who else is next, and will other countries in Africa follow suit?
The French withdrawal from Niger is the most recent sign of its waning influence across West Africa. In August last year, the last of the French troops stationed in Mali left. They had been there for 9 years to assist in the fight against armed groups, while French military operations in Burkina Faso officially ended in February of this year. And earlier this month, Niger, Mali, and Burkina Faso formed a mutual defense pact warning against foreign interference. All three nations are under military leadership after recent coups. Let's talk to Emmanuel Kwesi Anning, director.
Now, when you talk about here, we talk about French troops occupying those countries. That's no different than what the United States has been doing to other countries as well.
Director of Research at Kofi Annan International Peacekeeping Training Center. You're joining us from Accra today, and it's great to talk to you again. The French troops were in Niger to help fight armed groups. What will happen to that fight once they're gone?
Well, they were in Niger to help supposedly fight armed groups who would potentially.
Well, why supposedly? Well, would they have a track record of fighting armed groups in the region? Why supposedly?
No, actually, they have been a disaster from when President Hollande in Mali said he had dispersed terrorists. The end result was that he spread them all over the sub-region. And also the French track record on the sub-region is one of disastrous intervention and not really helping the countries in which they have been stationed.
So that part right there is very important. He's describing the French influence and actually their presence in Niger, in those countries, that they've actually just made things worse, which is what I've said before about intervention, not just U.S. intervention, but Western intervention in general. This is what happens, right? So the people in that country are worse off than they were before. And not to mention, they've been stealing their resources. The resources that the people in that country need, that most of the people in that country don't even get to use.
This is not going to affect the security situation in Niger at all. This is a great success for the military regime in Niamey.
Are you suggesting that the fight against armed groups in the region could actually benefit from the withdrawal of French soldiers?
The French presence has not improved the living standards nor the security of any of the countries in which they have performed in. I think we shouldn't deceive ourselves. These
they weren't there to improve living standards.
Pause right there. Think about what he just said. Let's go back just a little bit, because this is very telling. Very telling. I want you to hear the commentator. The commentator, by the way, if you cannot tell, is defending France. He's defending the intervention. So listen to what he says right here.
The living standards, nor the security of any of the countries in which they have performed in. I think we shouldn't deceive ourselves. These
they weren't there to improve living standards.
Did you hear what the commentator just said? He said they weren't there to improve living standards. Right. And they've only made their living standards worse. They shouldn't have been there in the first place. Imagine if another country's troops just came to the United States and just occupied, let's say the Northeast or let's say the East Coast, came into the United States and occupied the entire East Coast. We would push back on that, right? We would say, what are you doing here? We don't need you here to fight our battles. We don't need you here to try to tell us what to do and how to make things right. So put yourself in their shoes. Would you be okay with that? Would you be okay with, let's say, a country like Italy, if they sent their soldiers here to the U.S. to occupy the East Coast? Let's say we had massive riots or whatever happened in the East Coast, and they came in to supposedly fight for us or to fight against those people who are out there like rioting or whatever. How would you feel if another country sent their troops into our country and occupied it? I think most people would have a problem with that, but this happens all across the world.
They're there for counterinsurgency.
Of course, when there is security, it also improves living standards. But I think we shouldn't deceive ourselves. These military cooperation agreements are not for the benefit of the recipient states. They are for the benefit of the metropolitan or the metropoles. And
they're for the benefit of their self. They're not there for the benefit of people in Niger. They are there for the benefit of their own country, for the benefit of France. And they're there to steal some resources while they're there as well, bud. Like this is the thing. So the point that he just made is that if they're there to fight, that increases some type of security, correct? Well, according to him, if you increase the security, that should improve the living standards of the people, and the living standards have not improved. They've actually been worse.
That is why there's rejoicement in Niamey, because the military regime has been firm, the ambassador is leaving, and I think it has sent a clear signal to all observers of the situation in the Sahel that if governments are insistent on what their national interests are, they will get their way with it. I think this is a great day for the ordinary people.
The French soldiers, Kwesi, the French soldiers are leaving, but the American soldiers are staying, and they'll continue doing what they were doing previously.
That part right there, the American soldiers are staying. So I'm predicting that it may be only a matter of time before they push back against the U.S. soldiers as well and tell them to get out as well. And again, you really can't blame them.
Your thoughts on that?
Well, once more, this demonstrates that even our partners will cut corners and cut deals when it suits their national interest. The Americans learned how to speak a language that General Cheney and his team found acceptable. They were not belligerent. They appointed a new ambassador, albeit she has not presented her credentials yet.
So in other words, the Americans, when he says the Americans learned how to speak the language, in other words, the American soldiers, the U.S. government was more sneaky about it. The U.S. government found a way to make their presence there more acceptable, but they shouldn't be there either.
Americans understand the demands of the people on the ground across the sub-region, and they will tailor their politics and their policies to ensure that it is accommodating, it is respectful, it is consensual, dialogic, and that they will always find a way to do business with the people who are in power. The French have lost out, and it is because Mr. Macron has demonstrated a persistent arrogance.
So he feels Macron has been very arrogant when you compare him to the U.S. government. But I actually want to push back on him in reference to this. The United States is not your friend either. The U.S. isn't really there to help improve your lives either. You should look at them the same way that you look at those French soldiers. And I'm just keeping it real. This is where I feel like when we think about some of the other countries in the world, some of them still see the United States as their friend or their savior, someone who's coming there to help, even though, you know, other countries know that that's not the case. They've already had the experience with American intervention. But some of these countries still kind of see it as like, oh, yay, the U.S. is here. They're going to help. They're great. They're our friend. No, you should have a problem with them as well, not just France. Because let me be real with you, if the U.S. government wants to, especially now that you've pushed out the French troops, if the U.S. government wants to, they'll put sanctions on you too, just like Venezuela. And then we'll see how nice their language was if that happens.
Listening to the voices from the ground.
Okay, you know what? So we've been talking about the French. Let's forget about the French because they are effectively history in the region, right? As we detailed, they left Mali. They're no longer in Burkina Faso in any significant way, and they're going to leave Niger. What about the people of those countries? Whether it's Mali, Burkina Faso, or Niger, those are three countries that are deeply, heavily destabilized by the armed groups that are operating and that control parts of their sovereign territories.
That's their problem and their issue to handle. That is not the United States' job to come in and fix. That is not France's job to come in and fix. See, I never supported this. Never supported this. If there is conflict that's happening in another country, that is their domain. That is for them to deal with. I don't remember any of these people reaching out to France or the U.S. and saying, please help us.
Are the people in those countries going to live better, and are they going to get more security with the governments that are now in place, led by coup leaders?
This is a process. This is a process and it's going to take time. I am not worried.
But over time, is that a yes or a no over time?
This is none of his concern. The commentator here, you see what's happening here? And this happens all the time. the commentator here is trying to make it seem like it is the US government's concern, it is France's concern if there is some type of conflict that is happening in these countries in Africa, that they should have the opportunity to intervene. That is not of your concern. Just like what happens in the United States is not of other countries' concern. That's none of their business, especially if it has nothing to do with them. So notice how, this is what I was telling you before about Al Jazeera. You got to be careful with them. Sometimes they're good on some issues, and then other times they're not good. A lot of times, even Al Jazeera ends up taking the side of the Western powers that be, instead of these countries that are fighting for some type of independence. So don't think that just because Al Jazeera does a lot of international news and they cover these events that are happening in these countries, that doesn't mean they're on their side. That doesn't mean they support their fight. Oftentimes, they end up siding with the Western powers.
Oh, there's going to be security over time. But let's also not forget that the history of this continent has also demonstrated that there are times when the metropoles have themselves been deliberate manipulators of insecurity. So what is happening in Burkina Faso, in Mali, we cannot refrain from thinking, who are those who are giving these groups this new edge? Okay, and history will bear us out. That probably it is not just an innocent expansion of, violent extremist power. That probably there are other, forces who seek to undermine these regimes, who are providing new logistics, who are providing new intelligence. So long term, there's going to be stability, there's going to be growth, there's going to be better resilience, and communities are going to grow. I have no doubt at all that what is happening in these countries are a reflection of the broader, more dangerous geopolitical game that is being played, because these governments, under all conditions, must be made to follow. But when people know what is happening, then they will rally around these governments. And Niger has shown us that a determined leadership can do.
Okay, so let's get into this article here, because there's something else I've noticed in this Reuters article. They're doing the same thing. Now, I want to show you this piece here from Reuters. It says France to pull troops out of Niger following coup. Watch this, because when I read this, I was like, they actually have some nerve. France will pull its soldiers out of Niger following a July coup in the West African country. President Macron said on Sunday, dealing a huge blow to French influence and counterinsurgency operations in the Sahel region. Look at this. Dealing a huge blow to French influence. You see, it's not just about fighting back against these the militant groups that have risen up. It's never really about that. That's just a very good excuse for you to use to intervene as the other government. But dealing a huge blow to French influence. Why does there need to be French influence in African countries? I mean, Reuters just said the quiet part out loud. Why does there need to be French influence in African countries? There doesn't need to be. There doesn't need to be. I said the same thing about the British. Did you need to have British influence in African countries? No. Leave these countries alone and let them have their own culture and lead their own people. But there it is, folks. French influence. Let's continue. Macron said 1,500 troops would withdraw by the end of the year, and that France, the former colonial power in Niger, refused to be held hostage by the putschists. France's exit, which comes after weeks of pressure from the junta and popular demonstrations, is likely to exacerbate Western concerns over Russia's expanding influence in Africa. This piece right here is likely to exacerbate Western concerns over Russia's expanding influence in Africa. Now, do you see what they're doing? Now they're gonna make this fear, right? If we're not there, if we don't have troops there on the ground, then that opens the door for Russia to come in and to influence these people. That's why we, the French, we need to be there to influence them, to push away bad Russia. No one needs to be there to influence them. Not one of them. But do you see how this article was very telling? See how they're trying to spin this? Americans, everybody, you should be concerned because now that they have pushed France out of Niger, now that means that Russia is going to come and influence them. And they'll spin this narrative, by the way. They'll spin it. What does France stealing uranium from Niger and using these powers for their own people, what does that have to do with Russia? What does the West choosing and deciding the leaders of countries like Niger, what does that have to do with Russia? Nothing. Nothing at all. The French president has refused to recognize the junta as Niger's legitimate authority, but said Paris would coordinate troop withdrawal with the coup leaders. We will consult with the putschists because we want things to be orderly, Macron said. France's ambassador was also being pulled out and would return to the country in the next few hours. French influence over its former colonies has waned in West Africa in recent years. Just as popular vitriol has grown. I'm going to highlight French influence again. French influence over its former colonies has waned in West Africa in recent years. Again, this is what it is about. Its forces have been kicked out of the neighboring Mali and Burkina Faso since coups in those countries, reducing its role in a region-wide fight against deadly Islamic insurgencies. Highlight here, deadly Islamic insurgencies. This is the excuse that they give to be able to intervene in these countries. Until the coup, Niger had remained a key security partner of France and the United States, which have used it as a base to fight an Islamic insurgency in West and Central Africa's wider Sahel region. Again, this is none of their concern. This is the piece we all need to focus on right here. Russia's expanding presence. France's military base in Niger capital Niamey had become the epicenter of anti-French protests since the July 26 coup. Groups have regularly gathered on the street outside to call for the exit of troops stationed in the capital. On one Saturday this month, tens and thousands rallied against France. Pro-coup demonstrators in Niamey have waved Russian flags, adding the Western country's fear that Niger could follow Mali's lead and replace their troops with Wagner fighters. Why would that happen? What did Russia do to countries in Africa? You see, this goes much deeper, much, much deeper. Because it's not just Russia. There's also the fear of China, too, assisting countries in Africa. The West doesn't want that to happen either. Did Russia colonize people in Africa? Have you ever met an African? Amali Yeshitela was on JB's show earlier today, and he brought up a really good point. He said, I don't see any Black people in the United States with Russian last names. Before his death in a plane crash last month, Russian mercenary Chief Prigozhin spoke in a social media clip of making Russia greater on all continents and Africa more free. Africa more free. The West does not want this to happen. Wagner's future has been unclear since his demise. Wagner is also active in Central Sorry about that. In Central African Republic and Libya. Western nations say it is also present in Sudan. Remember, there is also a conflict that's happening in Sudan right now, though it denies this. Russian President Vladimir Putin has called for a return to constitutional order in Niger. French nuclear power plants source a small amount, less than 10% of their uranium from Niger. I argue this. I argue about that because when we first discussed this coup, when it happened, if I remember correctly, I could have sworn it was more than 10%. With France state-owned Orano operating a mine in Niger's north. You know, a lot of these countries in Africa, rich in resources, but the resources don't seem to go to the people in Africa. They go to other Western countries. Macron said he still regarded democratically elected President Bazoum, currently held prisoner by the coup leaders, as Niger's legitimate leader and had informed him of his decision. Legitimate leader. According to who? According to the West? Western countries for a long time have been heavily involved with deciding who can be president of nations abroad. Now, no one is allowed to do that in reference to the United States, right? So when I hear people like Hillary Clinton and this tangent that she's going on recently say, well, Putin did interfere in the election, Russiagate has been debunked multiple times. But to that point, the United States does this all the time. The United States government interferes in other countries' elections all the time. They install leaders and they remove leaders. Something to think about. But kudos, shout out to Niger for kicking Macron out. Now we'll have to sit back and wait to see if this is going to happen and expand to the U.S. as well, if they're going to push the U.S. troops out as well. But I say more power to them. It's their country, it's their land, it's their culture, and they need to be allowed to keep it that way. Let's go to some of the comments. Thank you for the super chat, Fat Man TV. America and Canada supporting Nazis, hashtag Operation Paperclip. Woo, we'll get into that. A kid says, Sabby, please consider after JFK's assassination, the entire history of the African continent continued on the path of abuse by its colonizers, including Belgium, France, the UK, and others. That's right. Lumumba was murdered with the help of the CIA only a few days before JFK took office. And he, Lumumba, would have changed the course of Africa's direction for the better. They don't want this to happen. They don't want any competing power.